My assistant knocked twice before opening the door. She said, "Your 10 o'clock is here." I told her to send them in. I was finishing a note on the file open in front of me. A restructuring proposal for a mid-sized logistics company that had come to us 3 weeks behind on its debt obligations. Standard work. The kind of problem my firm handled 12 times a year. I capped my pen and looked up when the door opened. The woman who walked in first was wearing a blue coat I did not recognize. The man behind her had more gray at his temples than I remembered. They both stopped when they saw me. Not a dramatic stop, just the small, involuntary pause of two people whose bodies have registered something before their minds have caught up with it. My name was on the wall behind me in brushed silver letters. My title was printed on the glass panel beside the door. My assistant had addressed me by both when she showed them in. I watched my parents look at me across my own office, and I thought about the last time I had seen them, which was 6 years ago on a day they were not there. My name is Naomi Briggs. I am 30 years old. I run a financial restructuring consultancy called Briggs Advisory Group, which I founded at 27 after 4 years of working my way through two of the most demanding firms in the industry. We have 11 full-time staff, a client list that includes 4 regional banks and 2 national retailers, and an office on the 9th floor of a building in the financial district with glass walls and a view of the river. I did not come from money. I did not have a mentor who handed me opportunities or a family connection who opened the right door. I had a finance degree that I paid for through a combination of scholarships and part-time work, a set of professional certifications I earned on evenings and weekends, and the particular kind of determination that grows in people who have been told, in various ways and with various degrees of gentleness, that their ambitions are probably too large for someone in their position. I am telling you all of this before I tell you the rest because I want you to understand that what happened in my office that morning was not the beginning of my story. It was the end of someone else's version of it. 6 years earlier, I was 24 years old and sitting in a folding chair in a university auditorium in a black gown that was slightly too large for me. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 10 in the morning. I had been in my seat since 9:15. The auditorium filled gradually around me, students finding their rows, families packing the tiered seating on either side, the particular noise of 200 people arriving with flowers and cameras, and the organized excitement of people who have been waiting for a specific moment for a long time. I had saved 2 seats. I had confirmed with my mother the week before. I had sent a reminder text the night before and received a reply that said, "We will be there, do not worry." I looked at those 2 empty seats through the opening remarks, through the dean's address, through the first half of the name calling. I looked at them the way you look at something you are not yet willing to stop expecting. My phone was in my pocket on silent. I had turned it to silent before the ceremony began as instructed. At the halfway break I checked it. There was one message. It said, "Something came up. We are sorry." The something that came up was my brother Tyler's regional volleyball tournament, which had been rescheduled at the last minute to the same weekend as my graduation. Tyler was 19 and had been playing competitive volleyball since he was 15. My parents had attended every tournament he had ever played in, including 2 that required overnight travel. I found out about the rescheduling from my aunt, who called me 2 days after the ceremony to apologize on their behalf and fill in the details my parents had not included in their text message. She said they had felt terrible. She said Tyler's tournament was a qualifying match that could not be missed. She said these things in the gentle tone of someone trying to make an injustice sound like a difficulty. I listened to all of it and thanked her and got off the phone. Then I sat in my empty apartment. I had moved out of student housing the week before graduation, and looked at the framed degree I had picked up at the administration office that afternoon, which I had propped against the wall because I had not yet bought a nail to hang it with. I did not cry. I made dinner and went to bed and started work the following Monday. I want to be honest about my family because this story does not work if I pretend they were monsters. My parents were not monsters. My father, whose name was Bernard, was a practical man who measured the value of things by their immediate visible results. He had run a small building supplies company for 20 years and understood the world in terms of what was tangible and useful. My mother, whose name was Gloria, was warm and social and deeply invested in the harmony of the family, which she maintained by smoothing things over rather than addressing them directly. Tyler was their easy child, uncomplicated, athletic, socially effortless, the kind of person who filled rooms with energy and received attention without appearing to seek it. I was their complicated child. Too serious. Too focused. Too interested in things that took a long time to produce results that other people could see and understand. My degree was in financial analysis. When I had told my father what I planned to study, he had looked at me for a moment and said, "Let us see how long that lasts." He had not said it with cruelty. He had said it the way people say things when they love you but do not believe in what you are doing. The 5 months after graduation were the hardest of my professional life, though I did not fully understand that at the time. I applied for 41 positions and received 7 interview invitations and 2 offers. I accepted the better one, a junior analyst role at a mid-sized restructuring firm called Carlyle Partners. The salary was modest, the hours were long, and the work was genuinely difficult in the way that work is difficult when you are at the bottom of a structure built by people who have been doing it for 20 years and have no interest in slowing down for someone new. I learned by watching and by staying late and by making mistakes and then making sure I understood precisely why they were mistakes before I made different ones. I called my parents once a month. The calls were brief and covered familiar ground. How I was eating, whether I had made any friends, whether the job was stable. My mother asked whether I had met anyone. My father asked whether the firm was reputable. Neither of them asked what I was actually working on, which was fine because I would not have been able to explain it in terms they would find satisfying in the 5 minutes the calls usually lasted. My first significant professional moment came 14 months into the Carlyle role. A senior analyst named Victor took a medical leave unexpectedly 2 weeks before a client presentation that I had been supporting from the research side. The director, a precise woman named Adiz who I had spoken to directly maybe 4 times in 14 months, asked me whether I could step in. I said yes before I finished processing the question. I spent 11 days preparing. I reviewed every piece of analysis Victor had produced, identified 3 areas I thought were incomplete, built the additional models myself, and restructured the presentation sequence to address what I believed were the client's core concerns rather than the approach we had defaulted to. Adiz reviewed my work 2 days before the presentation and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "This is better than what we had." She said it the way people say things when they are acknowledging something without making a large moment of it. The presentation went well. The client signed the extended engagement. Adiz began including me in the senior briefings the following week. I did not call my parents to tell them. There was no version of the story I could have told them in a 5-minute phone call that would have meant anything. I stayed at Carlyle for 3 years. In that time I worked on 19 restructuring engagements, led 7 of them independently in the final year, received 2 promotions and built a reputation inside the firm as someone who was reliable on the difficult cases. The ones where the numbers were complicated and the client relationships were fragile and the margin for error was narrow. I was building something on the side that I had not told anyone about except Adiz, who had become the closest thing I had to a real mentor. I had spent my 2nd and 3rd years at Carlyle developing a methodology for small to medium business restructuring that was faster and more cost-efficient than the standard approach most firms used. It was built on patterns I had identified across my cases, common failure points that appeared again and again in businesses of a certain size and stage. I formalized the methodology in a document that was eventually 60 pages long. I tested elements of it on 2 of my own client engagements. Both outperformed their projections. In my 4th year I left Carlyle and started Briggs Advisory Group with 2 colleagues, a 6-month financial runway and the methodology as our primary asset. The first year of Briggs Advisory Group was the kind of year that either builds you or breaks you, and I have spoken to enough founders since then to know that most people's first year does a little of both. We operated from a shared workspace for 8 months before we could afford our own office. Our first 3 clients came through Adiz's referral network. Our 4th came from a cold email I sent to a regional bank's head of commercial lending, which I had drafted and revised 19 times before sending. We were profitable within 11 months. I hired our first full-time employee in month 14. By the end of year 2, we had moved into our current office and I had repaid the personal loan I had taken to fund my share of the initial runway. I did not call my parents when we became profitable or when we moved offices. Our calls had tapered to quarterly and the conversations had not changed. Same familiar surface, same avoidance of anything requiring a real answer. My mother still asked whether I had met anyone. My father had recently retired and spent most of our calls describing the home renovation he was overseeing. The building supplies business had not been doing well for some time. I found out about my father's business through my aunt, the same way I had found out about most things in my family. She called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was between meetings and told me that Briggs Building Supplies, my father's company which he had run for 23 years, was in serious trouble. A large commercial contract that had represented nearly 40% of the firm's annual revenue had ended 18 months earlier and had not been replaced. The company had been burning through its reserves since then. There were creditors. There were missed payments. There was a bank meeting scheduled for the following month that my father did not know how to prepare for. I asked how long this had been happening. She said over a year. I asked why nobody told me. She was quiet. Then she said, "Your father did not want to ask you." I understood what that meant without her needing to explain it further. My father had spent 20 years building something and 25 years believing that his daughter's career, whatever it was probably less substantial than she thought. Asking his daughter for help with his business required him to revise both of those beliefs at the same time. He had waited until he had no other option. The appointment came through formally. My assistant Brianna told me on a Wednesday afternoon that a Bernard and Gloria Briggs had requested a consultation for the following Tuesday at 10 o'clock. She said they had been referred by First National Bank's Commercial Lending Division, which was one of our 4 banking clients. She said they had provided a brief on their situation, a small building supplies company facing debt restructuring, and asked whether we had availability. Brianna had no way of knowing they were my parents. My firm name was Briggs Advisory Group, which she had always assumed was simply my surname as a professional choice, which it was. I looked at the appointment on my screen for a long moment. I thought about declining. I thought about referring them to another firm. I thought about calling my father directly and having the conversation outside of this particular structure. In the end, I confirmed the appointment and said nothing to Brianna about the personal connection. I went home that evening and made dinner and sat at my kitchen table for a while without reading or watching anything. Then I got up and went to bed. I had a full day on Monday and I needed to be focused. I prepared for the Tuesday appointment the same way I prepared for every client consultation. I reviewed the brief they had submitted, pulled the public filings for Briggs Building Supplies, reviewed the credit history available through our banking relationship with First National, and built a preliminary picture of where the company stood. What I found was not unfamiliar. A business that had been solid for a long time, built on one anchor relationship that had eventually ended, followed by an owner who had responded to the loss with optimism rather than restructuring. The debt was manageable if addressed correctly. The core business still had viable clients. There were assets that could be leveraged. It was not a simple situation, but it was not an impossible one. I could see 3 possible approaches within an hour of reviewing the numbers. I noted them in my file, wrote my preliminary questions for the consultation and closed the folder. I was ready. I had always been good at separating the professional from the personal. It was one of the things that had made me effective at work since my first year at Carlyle. I was going to need that skill on Tuesday more than I had ever needed it before. They arrived at 9:58. Brianna showed them to the meeting room first, which was the standard procedure for new client consultations. I took 2 minutes before walking in, not from hesitation but because 2 minutes was how long I always gave myself before entering a first meeting. I gathered my folder, straightened my jacket and walked down the corridor. I opened the meeting room door and stepped in. My mother was seated on the near side of the table. My father was beside her. They both looked up when I entered. My mother's expression moved quickly through several things: recognition, shock, something complicated and immediate that I could not name from where I was standing. My father's expression moved more slowly. He had always processed things more slowly than my mother. He looked at me. Then he looked at the nameplate on the folder in my hand. Then he looked at the brushed silver letters on the wall behind me. Then he looked back at my face. I pulled out my chair and sat down and placed my folder on the table and said, "Good morning." My voice was steady. I had known for 5 days that this moment was coming and I had decided exactly who I was going to be in it. Nobody spoke for a moment. My mother found her voice first. She said, "Naomi." Just my name. Nothing attached to it. My father was still looking at the wall behind me. I said, "You were referred by First National's Commercial Lending Division. I understand you are looking at restructuring options for Briggs Building Supplies." I said it in my professional voice. Not cold, not warm, simply clear and direct, the voice I used at the opening of every new client meeting. My father looked back at me. He said, "We did not know it was your firm." I said, "I know." He said, "Brianna, your assistant, she did not say." I said, "She did not know." There was another pause. My mother's hands were folded on the table with the careful stillness of someone working very hard to maintain composure. My father was sitting with the particular posture of a man who has just understood the full weight of a situation and is working out how to carry it. I opened my folder. I said, I have reviewed the preliminary information you submitted. I have some questions before we look at the options. I placed my pen on the paper and looked at them both and waited. After a moment, my father nodded. We began. We worked through the consultation professionally. I asked the questions I had prepared. My father answered them accurately. He was a precise man when it came to numbers, and he gave me everything I needed without embellishment or evasion. My mother said very little but listened carefully and occasionally added a date or a figure that my father could not immediately recall. I noted everything. I asked about the anchor contract, the steps taken since it ended, the creditor relationships, the outstanding obligation terms, and what the realistic revenue floor looked like. My father answered each question without deflecting. He was a proud man, and answering his daughter's professional questions required him to set that pride aside in a way I could see was costing him, but he did it. He did not make it about anything other than the business. When we reached the end of my prepared questions, I closed my notepad and said I had enough to begin building a detailed assessment. I said I would have a preliminary framework to them within 10 working days. My father said thank you. He said it quietly and he meant it precisely, which was the most honest thing I could have asked for from that meeting. Then my mother said, "We are proud of you." She said it after the professional portion ended, in a voice that was sincere and also slightly too late, which I do not think she intended, but which was simply what it was. I looked at her. I said thank you. My father said, "You have built something real here." He looked around the office as he said it, at the glass walls, at the staff visible through them moving around the open floor, at the city visible through the window behind me. He said, "I did not think it would be like this." I asked him what he had thought it would be like. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Smaller. Slower." I said, "I know." I said, "I was wrong." I held his gaze for a moment. I said, "I know that too." There was no satisfaction in saying it. The story would be easier to tell if there was. There was just a quiet kind of truth between two people who had been circling something for a long time and had finally gotten close enough to name it. I stood and held out my hand. He shook it. We were professional and honest, and both of us were trying. I waited until they had left and the meeting room door was closed before I allowed myself to feel anything. I stood at the window at the far end of my office and looked at the river for about 4 minutes. Then I sat down at my desk and opened the Briggs Building Supplies file and began the actual work. Not because I was suppressing anything. I had learned years ago that suppression was not the same as composure, and that real composure was simply the ability to feel something and continue functioning. I felt the particular sadness of a moment you have been carrying for a long time finally arriving and turning out to be exactly as heavy as you expected. No heavier. I felt something that was not quite forgiveness but was the beginning of what leads toward it. And I felt the clean, clarifying sense of purpose that I always felt when I sat down to solve a real problem. The file in front of me was a real problem. It was also my father's life's work and my mother's security, and a company that still had 22 employees who came to work every morning without any of this context. I opened the model and started running the numbers. The preliminary framework I delivered 10 days later identified 3 viable paths. The first was a negotiated debt restructuring supported by a revised business plan. The second was a partial asset sale to reduce the debt load while preserving the operational core. The third was a controlled wind-down with maximized asset recovery, included because professional integrity required it, even though I did not believe it was the right outcome. I sent the framework to my father with a covering note that explained each option in plain language, outlined the timeline and cost implications of each, and recommended the first path as the most viable given the business's remaining strengths. I did not call before sending it. I simply sent it and waited. My father called me 2 hours after receiving it. He said, "I have read it." I said, "All 3 options?" He said, "Yes." He said, "The first one." I said, "That is what I would recommend." He said, "How long?" I told him 8 to 12 weeks to complete the creditor negotiations if things moved at the expected pace. He said, "Hey." He said it with the particular weight of a man who has accepted that the situation is serious and has decided to do what it takes. I told him we would begin the following Monday. The restructuring took 11 weeks. It was not simple. 2 of the creditors required multiple rounds of negotiation before reaching terms. The bank engagement was complicated by a clause in the original loan agreement that took 3 weeks to resolve with their legal team. One of the remaining clients reduced their order volume partway through the process, which required us to revise the revenue projections and reopen one of the creditor discussions. My father was present for every meeting he needed to be present for. He asked good questions and accepted the answers and did what he was told by the professionals in the room. He was not always comfortable with it, I could see that. But he consistently chose the business over his discomfort, which was the right choice and required something of him. My mother stayed in the background of the process but called once a week throughout those 11 weeks. The calls were different from the previous 6 years. Longer. She asked about my work in a way that required a real answer. She asked whether I was sleeping properly. I told her the truth both times. It was a new kind of conversation between us and it was awkward at the edges, but it was real. The restructuring was completed on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The final creditor agreement was signed. The revised business plan was approved by the bank. Briggs Building Supplies was no longer in default and had a clear, documented path forward. The company was smaller and more conservative and needed careful management for 2 more years. But it was intact. 22 employees still had jobs. My father still had his business. I closed the file on my end and sent a formal completion letter to my father and the relevant parties. Then I called him. He answered on the second ring. I told him the process was complete. He said, "All of it?" I said, "All of it." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I want to say something." I waited. He said I should have been there. He did not specify where. He did not need to. I had known he was carrying that since the day he walked into my office and saw my name on the wall. I said, "Yes." He said, "I was wrong about a lot of things." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry, Naomi." His voice was rough, the way voices get when a proud person is working hard to say something true. I thought carefully about what to say next. I had rehearsed nothing. I had decided years ago not to rehearse this conversation because rehearsed words close things down rather than open them. I said, "I know you are." I said, "I needed you there that day more than you understood." He was quiet. I said, "I am not telling you that to make it worse. I am telling you because it is true and we have been avoiding true things long enough that it has cost us both something." He said, "Yes." I said, "I do not want to keep doing that." He said, "Neither do I." There was another long pause. Then I said, "I am glad the business is going to be okay." He said, "Because of you." I said, "Partly. You had to do a lot of the hard things too." He said, "It was not the same." I said, "No. But it mattered." We stayed on the phone for another 15 minutes after that. We did not resolve everything. There is no 15-minute phone call that resolves 25 years of a particular family dynamic. But we said true things to each other and we both stayed on the line while we said them, and that was more than we had done before. My mother called me the following Sunday. She called in the morning, which was unusual. Our calls had always been evening calls after dinner when the day was winding down and there was time to fill. She said she had been thinking about what she wanted to say and had decided that Sunday morning was the right time to say it. She said, "I knew what your father thought about your work and I let his opinion become the whole family's opinion because it was easier." She said, "That was my failure." I listened to all of it without interrupting. She was not someone who said difficult things easily, and the fact that she had prepared this and chosen her moment told me something about her intention. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "Is it enough?" I thought about the honest answer. I said, "It is a beginning." She said, "I will take that." He said, "I want to do better." I said, "I want that too." We talked for 40 minutes that morning. It was the first time in my life I had talked to my mother for 40 minutes and not once been asked whether I had met anyone. The firm's annual client event was held in June, 8 weeks after the restructuring completion. It was a formal evening, dinner and industry outlook presentation, the kind of gathering where professional relationships are maintained and new ones begin. I had been hosting it for 3 years. I invited my parents. It was not a grand gesture. I had decided it was the right next step. Not a reconciliation dinner, not an emotional occasion, but a professional event where they could see my world in its ordinary form rather than in the high-pressure context of the restructuring. My father wore his best suit and my mother had her hair done. They arrived early and sat near the back and watched the evening with the attentive quiet of people who are in unfamiliar territory and have decided to pay close attention to everything. During the presentation I looked out at the room and saw my father watching me the way I had not seen him watch anything I did since I was a child reading aloud in a school play. His expression was not pride exactly, It was something more complicated and more honest than pride. It was recognition. I looked at him for one moment and then I looked back at my notes and continued speaking. Afterward, during the drinks portion of the evening, a colleague introduced himself to my father. He told my father that I had pulled off one of the cleanest small business restructurings he had seen in 3 years of working in the industry. He said it conversationally, the way professionals discuss work at industry events, as a fact without performance. My father listened to all of it. He asked 2 or 3 intelligent questions. The colleague answered them and moved on. My father came to find me afterward, near the end of the evening when the crowd had thinned. He said, "That man, your colleague. He told me what you do. What it actually takes." I looked at my father and waited. He said, "I had no idea." I said, "I know." He said, "How do you learn to do something like that?" I said, "You show up every day and do the work and you do not stop when it gets hard." He said, "You always did that. Even when you were young." I held those words carefully because they were true and because he had never said them out loud before. I said, "Yes, I did." We stood together in the thinning room and did not need to say anything more. My parents did not miss the next thing. They came to the firm's 2nd anniversary event in September. My mother called the day my firm was featured in a regional business publication and read the paragraph mentioning me aloud, slowly, as if she wanted to get it right. My father and I began a standing monthly lunch. Not long, not laden with unresolved things, just 2 people in a restaurant talking about work and the world and what was happening in each other's lives with the growing ease of people who have decided to actually know each other. It was not everything. I will not say it resolved cleanly because that is not how families work. And this story has always been about what is true rather than what is satisfying. But something had shifted in the foundation of things and what had shifted would not shift back. I had not needed their attendance at my graduation to become who I became. The degree was earned. The firm was built. The work had been done without their witness and had produced real things in the world regardless of whether they saw it. But they could see it now. And I had decided with full and clear intention that I was going to let them.